Welcome, comrades. Sorry for this slightly ropey start to our usually so professional webinar series. We are looking at the history of democracy in England and Ireland, and tonight we're looking at Thomas Paine and Edward Rushton and thinkers around that period. And we are starting with a short introduction by Kevin on Thomas Paine, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, comrades. Apologies for the technical problems, but I'm sure it'll be worth it when we do get going. Tonight's session is primarily going to focus on Edward Rushton, who is probably not as well known as he deserves to be, but Richie's late father wrote an excellent pamphlet on Thomas Rushton and really, I think, brought him into prominence, certainly on Merseyside and in the Northwest. And he's a very interesting example of a radical and a fighter for freedom and democracy against slavery and in support of struggles both in England and Ireland and further afield. But I'll let Richie talk more about that. What I wanted to do this evening, though, in just a very brief introduction, is to really talk about the period around Edward Rushton's life and to talk about some of the perhaps better known figures and some of the movements of the time. Rushton lived between 1756 and 1814, and as comrades will be aware, that's a very dramatic and an important period. It sees two major revolutions, the American Revolution in the 1770s and the 1780s, and of course the French Revolution in the 1790s. But it's also a period of great economic and social change, particularly in Great Britain and Ireland. The Industrial Revolution is now getting well into its stride, agrarian revolution as well. And this throws up all sorts of new political movements, primarily around democracy, but some movements as well for economic and social change. Of course, those two things are very closely linked. Now, one man links many of these struggles together, and that, of course, is Thomas Paine. Paine is a brilliant propagandist. He's active as a pamphleteer and a writer, and indeed a political activist in the American Revolution. He's English. He comes from Thetford in Norfolk, had a variety of jobs from being a customs man and a corset maker, through to being a political writer. And he was very active, very significant in the American Revolution. His newspaper and indeed his pamphlet Common Sense really put the case for independence and for revolutionary democracy in America. But perhaps more importantly, Paine's ideas spread into England. They spread also into France as well. And it's probably as the writer of The Rights of Man, which was a response to Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, essentially a defense of the ancien regime in France, that Paine is probably best known. And this sets forward his radical democratic ideas, in particular his ideas about political freedom and democracy, and his opposition to the idea of the divine right of kings, the idea of inheritance, and the inherited and the hereditary power of the aristocracy that was obviously very significant in the monarchies of that time. He not only was a brilliant writer, but a superb propagandist, and indeed his work sold exceptionally well. The Rights of Man had a print run of about 200,000, and as we know from contemporary accounts, it was read to groups of people, and indeed its ideas continued to influence socialists and Democrats in the 19th and the 20th century. Of course, putting forward ideas like that brought Paine to the attention of the British government. He'd returned from America and was active in Britain in the 1790s in defense of the French Revolution. And of course, he was then put under considerable pressure. He was threatened with arrest and he fled to France. To give you an idea of the radical milieu of the time, at one of his last meetings, he was advised by the poet William Blake not to go home. Don't go home tonight or you'll be effectively signing your death warrant. And Paine took the advice and instead skipped over to France, where he also played a political role. He was actually a member of the French Convention, hindered, I think, somewhat by his inability to speak French. And also, I suppose, in the more radical period of the revolution, he was not amongst its most radical members. But his ideas were certainly very influential. He was also, I think, a reflection of a much wider radical milieu in that period. And it isn't just professional activists of the sort of Paine. There is a whole range of working class and middle class groups emerging, demanding democracy, demanding political change. Many of those are a reflection of the political structure in Britain. And again, a reminder to comrades that the right to vote and indeed political democracy as we would understand it in any modern sense didn't exist. The electorate was perhaps around about 2 to 3% of the population, and considerable power still rested in the hands of the aristocracy and of course of the monarchy. So many members of the middle class, many members of the emerging bourgeoisie, many emerging capitalists were also excluded from political power. And many people saw the French Revolution as an example that could be followed in Britain, particularly in terms of its democratic demands. And so there was a great deal of sympathy and solidarity with the revolution. Fraternal groups were established. Working class and middle class organizations demanding reform also began to be set up. Radical newspapers emerged in this period as well, in the 1790s and in the early 1800s. So this is the type of world that Edward Rushton is part of. And in a way, Rushton stands for hundreds of thousands of other figures who are campaigning for change, who are campaigning for democracy and supporting those causes. He also, I think, stands for those thousands of working class and middle class militants who suffer repression. The government in England and in Ireland, of course, which we'll hear later on in our talks on republicanism in Ireland, met what they saw as this revolutionary challenge by repression. A whole series of laws were passed that prohibited political opposition, censored newspapers, and arrested political activists. And of course, these laws were also introduced to stop not only political organizations, but also working class organizations, trade unions. The 1799 Combination Acts are only the most well known of a whole series of laws that attempted to restrict political and economic and social struggles. So this is the world that Rushton is part of. It's a world of economic and social change. It's a world of new political ideas. And it's those sorts of ideas which I think we need to consider this evening. If you want to get a picture of that world, plenty of good general accounts. It's also, I think, quite interesting to read the work of people like Thomas Paine, whose arguments still, I think, have relevance today, particularly in terms of ideas of hereditary power and an inherited power and power of monarchy. And above all, the idea of a traditional society, the idea that the dead hands of the living, the dead hands of the past continue to control the living. And that idea that we must make the world anew and that we must judge institutions and ideas by their usefulness and by their value for society, I still think is a very important one. He was Paine and many of these other reformers and radicals were clear enemies of tradition. reactionaries like Burke and other defenders of monarchy were clearly not. And indeed, if you read Burke's work, Burke is very much lauded by political and social conservatives. You can see those ideas of our relationship to tradition and the way that society should be formed by tradition, formed by the past, and that indeed we live in a world in which there's a chain of connection, a chain of being with that past. Our job apparently is just to continue on, not to change, not to transform society. So those are some opening ideas, and I'll hand over now to Richie, and he can talk about Edward Rushton. I'm really looking forward to this. I've seen quite a few things that Richie's written about this, but it's always good to hear it from the horse's mouth. So thank you, comrades.
Thanks, everyone. Can you share the screen?
Yes, you
Yep.
can. Yep.
If I just put this up, can you tell me when to share?
Not yet. You should be able to do it. While you're looking for it, I'm going to read out a quote that I found from your review of your father's book while you're looking for this, which I quite like.
Oh, I'm looking for it. You've got to share the screen.
Oh, me? Well,
yeah,
no, I don't have...
yeah. It's I can't do it from this end. You've got to do it from your end.
What am I sharing, though?
You go to share screen and...
Yeah, what am I sharing?
Well, I shared in my screen, so I can put some slides up. Yeah.
Yeah, I've allowed you to share screen.
Is that it now? Sorry, I don't know. And I haven't done one of these with slides before.
We're all good.
Is that okay now? Can you see that? Okay.
I can see it. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Edward Rushton, and I sort of be talking a bit about how he was reclaimed from obscurity, about his early years and slavery, and then I'm going to go on to about some of his poetry and the revolutionary times that he lived in, and then come back to the theme of the overall event tonight, which is about republicanism and democracy and his place within that. Right. So Edward Rushton was really remembered because he started the first blind school, or he helped to start the first blind school in Liverpool in 1791. And that then became, later on, the later building was the Hardman Street building, which became the unemployed centre in the early 1980s. And within that building, there was the dome, which Mike Jones, who was Jack Jones's son, he painted the dome, that picture that was in the dome. I think it's basically gone now. It was pretty ragged when this picture was taken, and it was touched up. But he was remembered in because of the blind school, basically, and it was a folk memory that was passed down about the other his poetry and how he'd become blind. So I'm going to go on to say a bit about that. So he was born in 1756. Now this is a picture of 1754 of Liverpool, which is only a small place, as you can see. And so he was born in Liverpool, and he went to sea. He was apprenticed at the age of 16. So this is a slave ship, but he was only ever on one slave ship, and that was the only slave ship he was ever on. But when he was 16, he was on a ship, and he saved the ship from being overtaken by the waves, apparently, and so he was promoted to second mate. And one of the stories about him is that at the age of 18, as second mate on the ship, he was on a boat coming from shore to the ship, and he was with a young black lad called Kwamina. And what happened was the boat got overturned, and only one of them could be saved, and Kwamina allowed him to be saved by pushing him towards a piece of wood and then going off. So he saved Edward Rushton's life. So then he was on the slave ship, and people probably know the story that he went to help the slaves that were in the hold, who'd contracted this contagious ophthalmia, which makes you go blind. And he demonstrated with the captain that he needed to go and help these slaves. And the captain, because the slaves were only treated as cargo, would just lock the doors. But finally he got to help the slaves. But as a consequence of this, he returned to Liverpool, and that's how he became blind. So with being determined consciousness, of course, so he'd before going to sea, he'd been the prevailing views of the time were probably from Alexander Pope, whose his theories was the great chain of being, which was, it's said to be an early sort of evolutionary thing, but what it meant was it's the mutability of the species, that there was a whole list of things and everybody knew their place, and black people were low down on that. So everybody had to know their own place and stay in that place. This is there's a slide about the triangular trade at the time. So this was because the prevailing winds of the time, how this came to be, that the ships would go down to Africa and then over to the Americas and then back. And it's a diagram about the slaves and how they were packed in. And another one about branding, the branding of slaves. Obviously, these are probably not new to anybody. But there is something that's interesting about Liverpool, is that there are still people who deny that slaves were ever sold in Liverpool, but there's some evidence here. One of them, probably Kevin, is John Belcham from Liverpool University, who wrote this book about Liverpool 700, Liverpool 800, which celebrated the city of Liverpool as its 800th year. So, and then another slide showing the sale of slaves. And you probably can't see this because the things maybe is in the way of the this poem. This is from William Cowper, and this was, I'll read this out and then I've just got a few comments on it. It says, I own I am shocked at the purchase of slaves, and fear those who buy them and sell them are knaves. What I hear of their hardships, their tortures and groans, is almost enough to drive pity from stones. I pity them greatly, but I must be mum, for how could we do without sugar and rum? So William Cowper, Pity the Poor African, that was 1788, he wrote that. And then on the left, is the coin that was issued by the abolition for the slave trade. So the thing about this thing about for how could we do without sugar and rum, it sort of resonates today for us, because we've not long had in the city, we've had this arms fair, the electronic arms fair, and the council here more or less was saying the same things, don't like arms, don't like what they do, but we can't do anything about it, because if we did that, then the city would suffer. And so you can see the parallel there with this William Cowper. So the coin, it was the abolition of the slave trade, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, was established by Grenville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson in 1787. The most famous person who was involved in that was William Wilberforce, but he was only he was sort of at the, well, you could say the sharp end in the Parliament. There's an interesting book called Bury the Chains by Adam Hochschild, which is about Clarkson, who was really one of the main leaders of getting all the information together and interviewing, doing lots of interviews, put his life on the line really about that. And it's quite an interesting book. The problem for us is that it doesn't mention Rushton, but we know that Clarkson knew Rushton, and I'd actually interviewed him. And this is what's called Clarkson's map. Probably can't see all the detail of that, but it's a map of all the different people and all the tributaries running down to the abolition of slavery. And this is one corner of it, and we can see the Cowpers on this slide, Roscoe's on this slide, and then Rushton is underneath, and he's right at the bottom. And this is Clarkson's representation of how slavery will be abolished, running down into this big sea from all the tributaries. So in Rushton wrote quite a lot about the different revolutions that were going on at the time. He supported the revolution in America and supported Washington. And this slide is an idealized view of, it's quite funny really, because it just shows everybody's on an equal par. There's slaves in the middle are just being treated normally. But as we can see, Edward Rushton, he sent a letter to Washington, and he said that you, I say, should continue to be a slaveholder, a proprietor of human flesh and blood, creates in many of your British friends both astonishment and regret. Washington returned the letter unopened, but the letter itself is on the website, on the Edward Rushton website, which I'll give you the address of later. But it was a really powerful letter. And he's really having a go at Washington about his slaves. Your slaves, he says, it may be urged they are well treated. That I deny. Man never can be well treated who is deprived of his rights. They are well clothed, well fed, well lodged, etc. But feed me ambrosia and wash it down with nectar. Yet who are these if liberty be wanting? You took arms in defense of the rights of man. Your Negroes are men. Where then are the rights of your Negroes? Obviously, language is not we would use nowadays, but anyway. So Rushton defended the French Revolution, and he published several pieces, all in favour of the rights of man. And he even wrote to Tom Paine, but apparently the letter was returned unopened from him as well. So he was suggested that they should jointly campaign against American slavery, but he just assumed that Paine was unsympathetic to this. So he concluded that Tom Paine cared valiantly for the freedom of the white man. Now, that's a contentious thing, and I don't know whether it may be something that Kevin wants to take up. But anyway, back in Liverpool, he'd become a noted character and was marked out and even shot at. He was offered help by abolitionists, other abolitionists like Roscoe and Rathbone, but he refused, and he was determined to maintain his independence. He'd had various different positions. So he ran a pub, he ran a bookshop, he ran a newspaper, but maybe a bit more about that later. He wrote on the revolution. Again, I don't know whether anybody can see that. We can move the things out of the way, but it says, thy real friends, O liberty, must gaze on France with ecstasy, must hold that day forever dear, which closed a despot's proud career. And these lines were written after the Birmingham riots of 1791. So the Birmingham riots, they'd been organised by local officials in Birmingham to stir up the feeling against the French Revolution. Rushton wrote about the other revolutions as well, and other struggles. And he wrote about Ireland and the struggle for independence in Ireland, and Polish independence as well. So this one, he says, "O Ireland's fair daughters, your country's salvation, while the waves of old ocean shall beat round your shore, remember the woes of your long shackled nation." And this is Mary Lamore. He wrote quite a few, 3 or 4 poems about Ireland. He wrote about the revolution in Haiti. This is, again, looking at this, I actually put this, when I put these slides together, I found this, and I looked Mary Jean up, and it was just crazy, because this is a picture of a woman in a dress, and Mary Jean was a soldier. She was dressed in a soldier's uniform. She inspired the troops, and yeah, here we have this sexist, really, representation. And so Rushton wrote about Toussaint Louverture, and he wrote a speech that he felt that Toussaint had given to the troops. "Towering spirits, ye who broke slavery's agonizing yoke, ye who like the whirlwind rushed, and your foes to atoms crushed, ye who from Domingo's strand swept the daring British band, ye, O warriors, ye who know freedom's bliss and slavery's woe." So moving on, he was also, we mentioned one of the things where he was a pub landlord, and the press gang at the time, he'd married, Rushton had married in 1784. He wrote about the press gang, and his poem was called Will Clueline. So this was sold as like a penny pamphlet on the streets of Liverpool. Ye statesmen who manage this cold-blooded land and who boast of your seamen's exploits, think how your death-dealing bulwarks are manned, and learn to respect human rights. So this slide shows Wat Tyler, who was one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt, and who was this is Black Heath, I suppose, and he was stabbed when the king came to meet him. He was stabbed and killed, I think, wasn't he? So what he wrote, Rushton's poem, Superstition. In early days, if kings were made by men, and that they were, and still should be the light of nature shows, how come it then that the earth is filled with slaves? So Rushton was of a time when he still believed in the yoke, the Norman yoke. There was a Wat Tyler brigade in the Revolutionary Army of Cromwell, and there was an idea that their rights and freedom had been stolen, and that it was because of the Normans. And Rushton wrote about this in his poems. He refers to Milton, who had escaped. So Milton had escaped when the restoration of the monarchy, and he criticised obviously the restoration. He'd escaped with his life, although lots of his comrades had been executed. So there's the slide of the Milton and the poem Paradise Lost. And at the time of Rushton, there was the Rotten Burros, there was the Parliament was bought and paid for. This is a picture by Hogarth. This is from 1754. The mass of the population in the 17th century, they didn't have any democratic rights. There was for them neither parliamentary nor local government suffrage, and a small clique of big landowners, merchants and financiers who governed Britain. And you come to the London Correspondents Society, and there's another sort of another thing that we've come across in Liverpool, that there was societies all over the country. And these were linked to the London Correspondents Society was linked to the United Englishmen and the United Irishmen. So there was probably more in United Irishmen in Liverpool than sort of obvious the correspondence societies, but there was links. There was links in Liverpool anyway. So the London Correspondence Society was formed when 9 men met in the Bell, a tavern off the Strand, in 1792. And it must have been a thing to mint coins about at the time. So this was one about the Correspondence Society. There was a royal proclamation on seditious writing on that went before Parliament in 1792, and the Liverpool Corporation addressed the King on this proclamation and declared that the utmost industry is employed by evil-disposed persons within their kingdom, acting in concert with persons in foreign parts. So they decided that they were going to clamp down on all this. There was Globe meeting. This is an advertisement for a Globe meeting of the Correspondents Society, and you can see the names that are on there. So the government carried out the most vicious prosecution against the correspondence societies and those demanding the vote, parliamentary reform, or even equality. This is one of the cartoons of the time, which is, you know, horrible cartoon by Gilray. So Rushton was involved. It's not, I don't know of very much evidence that he was involved with the Correspondence Society as such, or he was an actual member of the Correspondence Society, but he did host a dinner for John Binns, who was on his way to Ireland. He was a member of the society. And he also, the story of him staying in London during the arrest and trial of Jeremiah Joyce, and he was charged with, Jeremiah Joyce was charged with treason along with Horne Tooke and Thomas Hardy. And he visited the Reverend Gilbert Wakefield. Rushton visited Gilbert Wakefield, who was imprisoned at Dorchester for sedition. And the thought was that he wanted to experience what it was going to be like if he was arrested. But being blind, I think he escaped quite a lot of it, the same as Milton did. He seemed to escape it because he was blind. Okay, what time have I got? Have I got long?
You can carry on a bit, comrade.
Right. So another event which was of real significance at the time, which was the Nore and Spithead mutinies. So this was in 1797. There's a picture of Parker at the Nore Head, and giving a proclamation to the captain of the ships. So it was Easter Sunday, 1797, when the crews are at Spithead and the Nore refused to take any orders. They were fed up with the appalling conditions on the ships, and they ran up the red flag on their ship and elected a central committee. So they expressed their solidarity with the French Revolution. So the mutineers were discussing removing the fleet to France, and some of the ships actually sailed for France. But after a month of mutiny, the Sea Lords, they sort of gave a pay rise and better rations to the Spithead, and they divided the comrades between Nore and Spithead and Nore, and they left the Nore seamen. So they had to still, you know, they demanded that they should have the same conditions as the Nore, but so they carried on with their occupation of the ships. But one by one, they went back over the weeks, and then Parker was arrested. He was hung along with, I think, 38 other seamen. So, right, so Rushton, Rushton died in 1814. So before that, in 1807, he had an eye operation. And there's another story, is that he had this operation without any anesthetic, and it gave him some sight in one eye. So that's why we see him with a patch on all the pictures, really. So, he continued his campaigns for equality and human rights. And one of his last compositions was a poem attacking Robert Sully, who'd been made poet laureate. Sully had written a eulogy on the great prospects of peace and freedom in a victory of the powers allied against France. Rushton wrote, "Despots of yore have crowned their heirs, but when, O Sully, tell me when, have despots raised their slaves to men?" So that's Rushton. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, comrade. Where am I? You have to stop screen now.
I don't know how to get out of it. Let's see.
Sorry, you have to. Okay, maybe I'll just.
Oh,
there we go. Sorted. Thank you very much, comrade. Okay, we've got one question already. I've got a couple of questions. How would you describe Rushton? He seems to have been born just in between various movements, so there wasn't a socialist movement yet. The Chartists only started, I think, about 30, 40 years after his death. Levelers were, that kind of movement that was about 100 years beforehand. Do you think he had was he a working, well, not working class, but sort of a liberal more than a socialist, or an early socialist? How would you describe, or Democrat? How would you describe his outlook? And I noticed that he was sacked from a few jobs because of his views, including as editor of the Liverpool Herald. I think that didn't go too well. But how would you describe his politics and his social class as well? I think he went to see, when he was 12, sort of to make riches. He was expected to make a lot of riches with the slave trade, but that didn't quite work out like that, because as you described, he was an abolitionist.
So, well, I wouldn't say that he wasn't working class, but I'm not sure that there was you would class that say that there was a working class at that time. I think there must have been workers, but so he came from a middle class family. His father was a hairdresser.
All right.
So they went badly off. Wouldn't have been a socialist, would he? Because but he was a revolutionary Republican. He was a Democrat. He believed in human rights. So where does he fit? What do you mean? Is he the same as Tom Paine, for instance? Yeah. Well, I would think that he's more. He was much more in tune with people, and didn't believe in this sort of chain of being, that there was this hierarchy, that people knew their place or had to know their place. He believed in equality, proper equality, and equality, and black people would be at that level, the same level as white.
Thank you. Okay, Steve, do you want to come in then?
Hi, Richie. I'm going to ask you a question first of all. Thank you very much for that. It was excellent. And I don't know whether you've seen this, by the way, if you can see me on that. Yeah. And I don't know whether it's still printed, but I've had this for a while. It's called.
So that's the CD.
It's called a talking book.
Yeah.
And
it's called. We made that in this room.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there we go then. So that's even better. Yeah. And I don't know whether you're still producing it, because I've had it a while. It's full of history, and it's full of poetry, and it's excellent. And I've actually used it on educationals, by the way, just to say that all your great efforts didn't go to waste, as far as I'm concerned. It was excellent, and it describes the life and time forgotten hero. Forgotten hero Edward Rushton, and it describes him as Liverpool's blind poet, as you've said, revolutionary Republican, an anti-slaver fighter, and by your dad, of course, which I knew, Bill, by the way, did a long time ago when I was in Liverpool, and he was obviously very much part of the socialist movement in Liverpool, and as a Trotskyist as well. And there's a really good poet. So I if it's still going, I'd say anybody's really interested. Okay. This would be.
So, well, this is the book.
All right, the book. Has it got a book as well?
That's the book, which me and Sue helped produce. Sue's here.
Hi, Sue.
Yeah. And so we helped him put this, well, we put this together, we got this put together and got it published. And we set up this group, Living History Library, which is already going, but we took over Living History Library to get this published. Because of this chap and the blind, we felt, well, we need to do something for blind people. And that's why that CD was produced.
Okay.
So we applied for some money, Expanding Horizons, something. So and we got that. So we produced that with Sue's daughter at the time.
Right.
All the tracks of that are on the website, edwardrushton.org. They're all on there. So if you go onto that website, you'll find the talking book, and the tracks are on that. In fact, there's more tracks on that than there is on that CD, because there was tracks we couldn't get onto that CD.
I mean, there's a great history. I mean, there's also in this is a great history story. So apart from Rushton's own story as a person, as a fighter, as a revolutionary, there is a good background history of our historical background of this period. So I mean, anybody interested just in history. But what's interesting is that there are lots of lesser known people, and maybe nobody ever heard of Edward Rushton, who've now been brought to light. There's more people like that, and the context for me, I think, is the things I'd like to make a couple of comments on that. One is that to understand that the popular movement in this country from the English Civil War from 1649 that was defeated right the way through to the 1770s, when the American Revolution and the French Revolution come about. That's the story we're telling here, right the way through to 1848 and right the way through to 1870. The dominant form of radicalism in the working class movement was republicanism, and if you went on demonstrations, you would see French tricolors, and you would see you'd see American stars and stripes, people carrying that. You can imagine now the way America's seen now, but at that time, even America was seen as a great icon of liberty. And the point about republicanism that people don't understand, but this point is made here, is that republicanism was not so much about getting rid of the king or queen. It was about freedom and liberty. And the anti-slavery movement there was classic. You know, the fight against slavery was a fight for freedom and liberty, and it became entirely associated with republicanism, the overthrow of tyrants, which is where the Haitian story and the Haitian revolution figures in this story. Because the revolt of the slaves, you know, that's what killed slavery, not the campaigners in this country as much as the revolt by the slaves. And the story of there is, of course, the official anti-slavers. Rushton was a much more militant anti-slaver than the kind of bourgeois leaders. Again, it's explained in that story, and because it was about human rights. So this was the revolutionary tradition at the time. And of course, this was before Marx came along. Well, when Marx came along, he started out as a Republican. We've been studying this thing called Citizen Marx. And Marx started out as a Republican before he became a communist, before he turned to communism and socialism. But, you know, we can see people arguing that socialism wasn't set up as an alternative to republicanism. In a way, some people think, well, socialism came along and republicanism disappeared. But other people think that actually republicanism is really incorporated into socialism, becomes part of it, and that you can transfer the idea of fighting slavery to fighting wage slavery. That Marx, using the term wage slavery, is making a comparison that in order to get freedom for the working class, the class of wage slaves, then we need republicanism in our workplaces. We need democracy is absolutely central in that fight for freedom. And in the same way, I suppose that Marx took Adam Smith's theory of labor theory of value and turned it into a revolutionary idea of the labor theory of value. In his republicanism, he's taking that earlier republicanism and turning it into something more revolutionary as an alternative to wage slavery, to democracy in the workplace. So I think, Edward, I can just recommend this, but this I think is a great contribution to a Republican tradition that we need to really know about. And I really was inspired by that. And of course, the Diggers as well is another big festival. There are all these local histories where people are discovering people like this that are unknown and yet played a great role. Yeah. So thanks for the talk, and I will encourage people to get the CD or read the book or
there's no CDs now, but there is.
No, sorry, that's ancient technology then. Yeah, it's absolutely true.
Well, so it's there, and you're quite right. I mean, the book and that there are some books, by the way, but that talking book, when my dad researched all this, and he says that he found out in the early 70s, he found this amazing character, Edward Rushton, in the early 70s, and he researched that, and there was very little. There was very little. His poetry was there, but there was very little about him, and there was nothing about his wife. In fact, as Sue said at the time we were doing the book, said, well, what about his wife? You know, and my dad said, oh, well, you know, I haven't found anything. So we said, well, they should have something there to say that he had a family, and so we sort of put that in as well. Yeah, but the main part of the book is not about Rushton himself. It's about his life and times. It's about everything else that's going on, as you rightly said. Yeah, because there's more come to light about Rushton since then.
Yeah.
And there's been other books written that are more explore more about him. But that's Rushton again. Yeah.
Thank you, Richie, and that was very enjoyable. I think it's really important that we reclaim people from our history that have been forgotten, because as we know, history has been written by a certain section of the population, not our forces. Kevin also wants to come back in, and he has to leave to a different meeting, so I'm just going to bring him in now.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Thanks, Richie. That was excellent. I think you're right about trying to locate people in their times. Thomas Paine was, I think, to the right, if we want to think of it in those terms, of Rushton. I think his politics would have been radical democratic. He didn't favour, for example, the abolition of private property, and indeed probably his ideal society would have been a sort of small property owning republic. In France, for example, he was not in favour of the execution of the king, and indeed sort of stood, I suppose, closer to the Girondins rather than the Jacobins. So that would locate him politically. In terms of slavery, though, he did write a pamphlet in 1775 on slavery in the United States. And I'm wondering about this business of people not opening his Rushton's letters. I mean, he seems to be a bit unlucky on that. And I suppose all I can say is that he seems to favour abolition. Although, if you look at one of the arguments there, is he seems to want this to be carried out maybe in a paternalistic way. And he suggests, for example, that that this might have to be gradual, or there might have to be some sort of tutelage for the slave population. But I think you in pointing up the difference, you've sort of located Rushton, I think, correctly, as being much more radical than Paine. Although the point about Paine is, and often is with ideas, is that once you put forward an idea, someone's always going to take it much further, thank God. So Paine was, when he, for example, attacks the hereditary principle, people then take that on in terms of property ownership. On the point about class, I think again that's very interesting, because there is a small proletariat, because there are factories. But I mean, in a place like Liverpool, it would have been largely sort of small workshops and sort of journeymen, and obviously women workers as well. And I would think that you, as in the French Revolution, you would have a sort of small property owners consciousness that would be very democratic, but would not favor anything approaching socialism or communism. I mean, you know, we all know about Babeuf in the French Revolution, but you know, he was really quite exceptional in that sense. There was something else I was going to say, and I think I'm glad you pointed out the connections with people like Wilberforce and Rathbone and so on, is that these establishment figures get all the credit all the time. You know, they're the ones who are on the stamps, you know, and the same is also true for a little bit later, and I'm sure we'll bring this in, and that is, of course, the working class solidarity in the 1860s with the struggle against slavery and against the Confederacy. Which again, in terms of solidarity, you know, Marx wrote a lot about that, and I think that again is another episode which is, you know, is sort of known in Lancashire, but is not as well known outside as it should, and neither is the fact, which I always bang on about, which is that the employers and the merchants of Liverpool were solidly behind the Confederacy. Indeed, even in St. George's Hall, had a great big benefit for the Confederacy. So that sort of thing should be drawn to the attention of certain people who want to play down the role of the capitalists in Liverpool. John, one just last point, and it's really, you know, paying tribute to people like your dad who worked on this sort of project. And E.P. Thompson, when he got together his celebrated book on the making of the English working class, which appeared in 1968, if you look at the introduction to it, he makes the point that a lot of the research and indeed a lot of the discussions came out of his adult education classes, and it came from the sort of scholarship of working class people working as a group. And if you read that, or you know, if people read that, you get a real sense of the struggles, and there's still a massive amount of stuff to be done about all sorts of working class struggles. And I think that as well as the usual political campaigning and all the things that we do, I think history is absolutely vital. And I think the sort of work that your dad did and what you've done in continuing, you know, there's a lot more. There will be many more figures like Edward Rushton throughout the country. I mean, when I do the talk on Chartism, I'm going to draw attention to a figure from the town that I grew up in, which is Chatham in Kent, which is where the Nore, the Nore is the confluence of the Thames and the Medway, and the ships actually were out of Chatham. But he's another figure which until very recently was not given the prominence, and there are a whole number of those sorts of figures that we can draw attention. So thanks very much, Richie, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm glad you were able to speak once we got on there eventually.
Thanks, Kevin. Richie, did you want to reply to anything that Kevin said? You need to.
Right, sorry, I just had it on mute. There's only one thing, and that was when you mentioned about the Confederacy, and there's the Alabama was a ship that was made in Camel Heads on the other side of the water here, the Alabama, which it wasn't known as the Alabama when it was being made, but it was commissioned by the Confederate side of in America, and it was chased all over the Atlantic Ocean, I think, and was sunk by France by a British frigate. I think, yeah. So that was the only thing. That's an interesting story about the Alabama.
Yep. Thank you. Ken has a question or a comment.
Thanks very much for the talk, Richie. You mentioned that Rushton's views were more radical than many of his contemporary poets. How far did that inhibit publication of his poems, and how far did he actually influence others to become more radical? Did it make it more difficult for him to be published in magazines or in book form?
Yeah, I would say that's right. It did. He seemed to rub people up the wrong way, which is what they always say about people who you don't agree with. You know, he was uncompromising was the word that's always been used about him, and his, as was said, his father set him up as a landlord in a pub, and he at that point the press gang was totally opposed to the press gang, and he helped sailors to evade the press gang, but he wasn't suited for that, and I think he must have been with a party. I don't know really. It's very hard to visualize someone who's blind being running a pub. So, you know, anyway, so there was the newspaper that he was involved in, and it would have been much more prominent, only he fell out with his partner over the views of what they were supposed to put in it. Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it's the same today, isn't it? You know, how influenced, you know, we have these people called influencers now, don't we? You know, who the people follow. But how influential can you be if you keep getting shut up and nobody recognizes what you're saying because you're too radical for them, especially in a place like Liverpool where everybody wants the slave trade.
Thank you. Tony has a question or a comment. Oh, Tony, there's something strange. You sound like Mickey Mouse. Ooh.
It's your mouse, Tony. Move your mouse.
Okay, no, sorry, you sound like Mickey Mouse. I think you might have to go out and come in again or something. Ooh, that was unpleasant. Or maybe type your question, perhaps, because you were the last person to have his hand up, which is a shame. So we'll try again. Do you want to try again, Tony, to unmute? I've just sent you a message to unmute.
Is it any good now?
That's better. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. On a personal level, I'm surprised he was so active and did so much when he was blind. How actually did he cope? He seems quite an amazing guy. I have really a series of random comments, I suppose. Tom Paine, I think you mentioned he wrote a letter to regarding slavery and his attitude. Do you know what Paine's attitude was to slavery in America? Did he ever have a definitive position? Because I know he's considered the pamphleteer of the American Revolution, but I wondered whether he played down his views or whether he had no views or what. So I'd be interested to know about that. Regarding the anti-slavery movement, I think we should be clear. There was really two wings to it. There was a mass movement, a radical movement, and then of course there was the kind of bourgeois conservatives represented by William Pitt and Wilberforce, who were extremely hesitant and cautious about moving towards abolition. We know that both. Pitt was extremely a repressive prime minister, and Wilberforce was equally conservative. He supported the Coercion Acts and so forth. So I was just interested in your comments. I also think it might be useful having an education session on the history of the anti-slavery movement and the abolition of the slave trade, because it's an area which, of course, you don't even touch upon in school, and when you do come across it, it is, as was said, always in terms of William Wilberforce and how much he achieved. We don't hear, for example, that William IV, I think he was then called the Duke of Clarence, spoke and voted against the abolition of the slave trade in the House of Lords. I mean, when it came to the bicentenary of Wilberforce, and the Queen, of course, witted on at length about the magnificent role he played, she omitted the role of her own ancestors, of course, in that. But I think it would be quite useful to know that. And it's also interesting because Liverpool, which was, I think, the second major slave port after London itself, was in those days anything but a radical city. I think Clarkson very nearly escaped with his life when he was nearly thrown into the Mersey, whereas Manchester, which was the capital of cotton, was a very radical place. 1 in 3 Mancunians signed an anti-slavery petition, for example. So it's quite interesting to contrast the 2 major cities, which are only 40 miles away. I'd also like to just throw out a few comments regarding Steve and republicanism, which comes up without fail. I think in those days, republicanism was a revolutionary demand, without a doubt, and a revolutionary movement. But I think today that is not the case, and that is why it is confined to the margins. There is, although it's a democratic demand to get rid of the monarchy in Britain, it's not a revolutionary demand by any means. As we know, many, or in fact most capitalist countries today are Republican. So I'll leave it at that. So they're just random observations, really.
Okay, thanks, Tony. How did you manage being blind, or not being blind? I mean, we had this discussion when there was a play done by John Davis. He wrote a play about Edward Rushton, which was put on about 5 years ago. And one of the discussions was about being blind, and I think we sort of came to the conclusions that it was a bit condescending of us to assume that about people who are blind, that they've got this disability that stops them doing things, that it's just one of the senses, and the other senses are enhanced when you're blind. We have one of the actors in the play, which actually lives in our road, and the whole family, they are deaf and dumb, and she was in the play. And you suppose you could say, well, how did it come being done? But she's amazing, you know. She's in all of these. She's an actor. So I think so for being blind, there's also the case of somebody who knows about Rushton and Liverpool, which is someone called Steve Binns, who's blind, and he's just, you know, the stories that he did tours of the town hall in Liverpool. So he'd take people around. He'd he'd have a book with him, and he'd put it down. Or this is the tale that I got told. Is one of the tours he had this book, and he put it down on a desk, and he took them on a tour all over the town hall, and came back half an hour later, and he just picked up the book, and he knew exactly where it was. And he's just knowing, he just knows everybody. He knows everybody by their voice. He knew us years later.
He's an expert
when we
on Rushton,
we haven't seen him for years. Yeah, expert on Rushton. Yeah, so that's Steve Binns. As for Tom Paine, I think Kevin probably knows more about that than me. He said he's got a pamphlet that Paine wrote about slavery. I haven't seen anything that Tom Paine's done on slavery. I haven't read the Right of Man. I don't know whether only bits bits of it and references to it. I've read The Right of Women, but not The Right of Man. And so Kevin's probably better to speak to about that. The two movements, the official and the unofficial. It rings bells, doesn't it, everywhere, that, because that's what happens with everything, isn't it? You know, today we have all these movements, which have the official movement and we have the unofficial movement. We have the official Hillsborough movement who do work with all the higher ups, and then we have the unofficial Hillsborough movement who do all the activism. Yeah, the IRA and the provisional IRA, I suppose. I don't want to go into that one, but we seem to have that's a model that happens everywhere, that official and unofficial. I think Liverpool was the main slave centre where the ships went from anyway. So there was more registered ships in Liverpool than anywhere else in the world. I think so. But you know, I mean, you may be right. Yeah. As for Manchester, well, Manchester didn't have any MPs. Liverpool had MPs. Manchester didn't have any democracy at all. They didn't have, you know, they were much more radical in that than Liverpool. Liverpool wasn't very radical at the time. I mean, there was radicals in Liverpool, but they weren't anywhere as near as radical as Manchester.
Yeah. Thank you very much, comrade. So, unless there's any more questions, but I don't think there are.
I was just going to add a quick comment that Thomas Paine also at some time during his life lived in Lewes, which is the county town of East Sussex. And there is a pub where he stayed and I think held the discussions. So anyone who's down in East Sussex or Lewes may want to go there.
Thank you.
I can't remember its name offhand either.
Maybe the Thomas Paine or something. No. Okay, there's Maria also posted in the chat that Thomas Paine did campaign against slavery and was involved in setting up the first abolitionist group in America. So there we are, because Kevin has had to leave for another meeting. Thank you very much, Richie, for bringing us this very interesting and brave campaigner closer. What we're doing actually after this series, we are going to look at what we're calling the lives of the left, where we're going to look at people. I mean, we've now done Edward Rushton, but we'll be looking at people from our history that have been largely forgotten and want to revive them. So similar to what you've just done today, but having a session on the anti-slavery movement and, you know, looking at the movement from below as well as the movement from the bourgeois liberals, etc., would be very useful as well. So thank you very much for that. Next week, comrades, we are going to look at the Peterloo massacre of 1819 and the republicanism of Percy Shelley, which should be very interesting. And so I'll see you then. Have a good evening. Thank you, Richie. Thank you.
Before you go, could I just put a plug in for the website? I tried to put it into the chat, but if I send it to you, can you send it out? It's Edward Rushton.
I've just seen it. Let me put it out to everybody. It's www.edwardrushton.org.
Oh, it's up. It is up there. Edward Rushton.
Yeah, you put it to host and panelists, but I've just put it to everybody. So Edward Rushton.
On there, there's the recordings that was spoken about.
Yeah, great. And I'll put when we're putting this out as a video, we can put the website with it as well. So thank you very much, Richie and Sue. Goodbye. Have a good evening and see you next week, comrades. Bye-bye.